Sup, freaks? This episode was brought to you by our good friends at Crowd Health. Crowd Health is here to help you reimagine how you pay your healthcare costs, how you take care of your healthcare. Crowd Health is not health insurance. It's actually trying to get more and more people to walk away from the health insurance industry because it's an opaque black box where you throw money in, you don't really know what's going on with it. You don't know how your healthcare costs are being negotiated on your behalf by the health insurance companies. You really don't know if you're being taken care of or not. Crowd Health is here to fix that. What you do when you join Crowd Health is you join a community of people who are taking care of themselves and who really want to become sovereign with their healthcare. What you do is you become a member and you pay a monthly fee. That fee goes to a dedicated health account, a bank account that you control, that you have visibility into, that you can always take with you at the end of the day if you decide to move away from Crowd Health. You pay that monthly subscription fee, and then if you ever have a health event, you bring your healthcare bill to the Crowd Health team. They go to the doctor, negotiate your health expense down to a lower price because they actually work on your behalf as opposed to the insurance companies. And then you pay the first $500 of your healthcare cost, and then it goes out to the Crowd Health community, and your bill is crowdsourced. To date, they've had 100% of their healthcare bills paid, and it's a beautiful thing. They're also adding a Bitcoin component where a portion of your monthly subscription fee will get put into Bitcoin. So you have your fiat dollars alongside your Bitcoin account. Again, you have access to both at the end of the day if you ever want to walk away from it. But again, it helps you lower your healthcare costs because they're there to negotiate on your behalf. It's a much more personal experience instead of calling a 1-800 number. When you become a Crowd Health member, you have a dedicated health advocate who is the same person throughout your time with Crowd Health, who's going to walk you through everything you need to do and make sure that you're getting the best care that you can get that you can possibly get. Go to joincrowdhealth.com/TFTC. The first 1,000 members of the Bitcoin community are going to get, using the code TFTC, are going to get $99 a month for the first 6 months of their healthcare, of their Crowd Health cost. So go check this out. Me and my family, we use Crowd Health. We've decided to opt out of the traditional health insurance industry. Again, it's very opaque. Feel like it doesn't really take care of us. So come join us in the Crowd Health community. Use the code TFTC.
You've had a dynamic where money's become freer than free.
If you talk about a Fed just gone nuts, all the central banks going nuts.
So it's all acting like safe haven.
I believe that in a world where central bankers are tripping over themselves to devalue their currency, Bitcoin wins. In the world of fiat currencies, Bitcoin is the victor.
I mean, that's part of the bull case for Bitcoin.
If you're not paying attention, you probably should be.
I reread your piece in Quillette this morning. I think it's very important work what you're doing, especially right now.
Well, in a sense, it's a blinding flash of the obvious, but sometimes important things are like that. There are things that I suppose we all knew, actually, but weren't quite facing up to. And the character of wealth, I think, is one of them. Well, we should talk about this. But are we already working on your broadcast? Are we pre the broadcast? Do you want to start?
Well, I hit record since I didn't have a producer, and I figured we could.
Yeah, as you like. Yes, the Quillette piece is the latest version of these thoughts, and I'm hoping to build on that as I go along. It's frustrating that there are so few of us willing to take this physicalist perspective on wealth seriously, since so much is at stake. And if we get this wrong, according to my view, we may be jeopardizing the accumulated wealth and sophistication of several millennia. And once you start slipping in this way, it could be very dangerous for us indeed. And we tend to think of wealth and sophistication, and particularly intellectual sophistication, as permanent acquisitions. They're very far from it. Intellectual sophistication is like any other physical state. It's vulnerable to thermodynamic decay, and conceptual elegance and sophistication can easily be lost. Technology is not a permanent acquisition. You've got to keep on maintaining it through the social reproduction of knowledge. And I'm concerned that we may be moving into a time when our energy supply is not adequate to maintain not only the gross physical sophistication of our road networks and our buildings, but also our intellectual sophistication, at which point we really do become very vulnerable to unbounded slippage. You just you climb slowly in civilizational terms, but you fall fast, and we know that from the historical record. So I'm pretty concerned about it. So I'm very committed to making sure that these ideas actually get across, but it is frustratingly slow. Largely, I think, because of conventional economics. I regard the field of economics as a bit of a curse, actually, particularly macroeconomics. Microeconomics is humble but decent stuff. It helps you run a business and that sort of stuff. It's basically accountancy. I have a lot of time for accountants, actually. Not exciting people, but they're much closer to the real world than macroeconomists, who I think give false comfort to politicians and also to decision makers in large corporates, who genuinely don't really know what they're doing. They have so poor a grasp of the physical actuality of the real economy. They constantly blunder and make decisions which affect all of our lives, whether we wish them to or not.
That's been a reoccurring theme here on this show. Is we're not too fond of academic economists as well. And I think what you just described there is that these individuals are completely detached from the source of information, and they try to granularly control complex systems and centrally plan them, which is not possible.
No, even the liberal economists, I think, are unrealistic about what matters to people. They don't see what people are doing. One of Richard Scarry's books, I have small children, one of Richard Scarry's books I read recently with them is entitled What Do People Do All Day? Well, it's a pretty good question, actually. And it's not quite clear what they are up to, but I don't think it's so difficult to work it out. What people are actually doing is gathering resources to secure reproduction. They're protecting their families. They're investing in their future reproduction. And it's that which I think misleads so many economists. They think of people as being hedonic robots, just seeking sensory satisfactions of various kinds. But those are all proxies and intermediaries. What they're actually doing is safeguarding the futures of their families. And this is why there's this constant friction between economic expectations and what people actually do. So economists look at human behavior and think of it as rather irrational, but much of what appears to be irrational makes a great deal of sense when you regard them as organisms like any other, seeking satisfactions as proxies for the development of their own family trajectories.
And reacting to new information that is local to them.
Yes, which they know very well. And the academic economists know not at all. In fact, yeah, absolutely.
And bringing this back to the concept of energy and the fact that you believe that humanity is energy blind right now, I really like that part of your piece in Quillette that essentially likened humans' relation to their understanding of energy is similar to a fish's understanding of water, where it just surrounds us, but we don't really understand how it works and the importance of it. And there's a causal loop of humans' ability over time to harness energy, most importantly, more denser forms of energy to be more productive throughout the economy. And it seems that for some reason or another, over the last 2 to 3 decades, the powers that be have decided to completely ignore thermodynamics and the reality of physics, and the fact that we've only gotten to this point because we've found denser and more abundant forms of energy.
Absolutely. I mean, you say the powers that be, but the powers that be in the West, the powers that be in Asia seem to understand these matters pretty well. And they're running their economies as if energy density actually did matter. And they're benefiting hugely from it. And I was in the States recently giving talks to people in the Denver oil and gas world, and I was surprised how few of those people, some of them understood it very well, but many didn't, that American energy consumption is not in a good state. You've been flatlining since the early 2000s. It's worse in Europe, by the way. Our energy consumption is falling quite sharply. Those sorts of indicators ought to be front page news. They should be really very controversial. There should be seminars every week in Washington on why is it that American energy consumption is stalling in this way. Is that this is just not a good sign, but people are indifferent to it. And I think this energy blindness is an interesting way of looking at it. I think that's literally likely to be true. We're developing this idea. It's not fully fleshed out yet. But it seems very likely that awareness of energy has not been a strong selective advantage in human history. You can get by without it, but we can't get by without it. We've developed such sophisticated societies. We're so far from thermodynamic equilibrium that we're vulnerable to our misunderstanding. So it's now a selective pressure. Those who understand energy will obviously prosper, and those who don't will go to the wall, which is where it seems to be going with me. From my perspective, I think the West is in a very bad state, and will find it very difficult to recover. And I trust that we can, but I'm not optimistic at the moment. As you say, our governments seem determined to ignore these realities and to pretend that one can actually power and maintain, that's a crucial point, and maintain complex civilizations with inferior fuels such as wind and solar. And we're blind to that quality issue. So when we talk about energy blindness in that piece that Deborah Lieberman and I wrote for Quillette, we're thinking that they're blind to things that really matter about it. People understand quantity because they tend to reason in terms of, have we got enough? Have we got enough food, for example? Have we got enough vegetables and meat and honey or whatever? And enough is not the right question to ask about energy. It's a subsidiary question. The principal question to ask is, have you got enough of the right quality? Have you got the right quality energy? And then you say, have we got enough? And the first law of thermodynamics tells us you've always got enough. Energy is conserved. It's never lost. It's always there. But it's the quality which is declining all the time over the entire system, the universe. And locally, of course, you look for high quality sources in order to be able to do the work that you require. Having enough is just not the problem. So people will say in a sort of blithe and rather foolish way, there's an enormous amount of energy in the wind flowing around the world. Perfectly true. There's a huge amount. There's a huge amount of energy in falling raindrops. But it's of such high entropy, it's so disordered and chaotic, it's of no earthly use to anybody. How is it we've got to this point where such a very basic physical point should not be a criteria of great importance in government policy? But we really have. And so the President of the United States can push through with the Inflation Reduction Act as if these low-grade sources are remotely adequate to sustain you as a nation, as a defensible and capable nation. The IRA is a disaster for the US and indeed for all of your allies too. So reversing the IRA is a matter of very great importance for the American people. And I can only hope that at some point people in the Democratic Party will wake up to the dangers of what they're doing, and that in the Green Party, the Green movements as well, that they will understand that you cannot push through with an environmental agenda if you're going to jeopardize people's health and well-being in the way that they are actually doing. They're going to lose this argument. There will be a dramatic reversal of the environmental movement at some point, unless they decide to accept that there have to be high-quality sources of energy in the decarbonisation mix, which of course means nuclear, to which they have an unreasonable objection.
Yeah, the Green Party was just celebrating the wind down of more nuclear plants in Germany only about a month ago, which is
right,
which is fascinating. And I agree with you. I think there's going to be a shift in perception toward energy policy in the West as the situation in Europe unfolds and things become more precarious in that part of the world, and even here in the United States with the overt confrontational posturing from the Biden administration with the oil and gas industry and rising gas prices. Obviously, they've fallen in recent months due to the fact that we are reducing the strategic petroleum reserves, but that should end at some point. There's already talks of diesel shortages hitting the market at some point in the next couple of months. But agreed, I think the public perception is beginning to shift. I think it's already shifting materially, but that trend will only become exacerbated. And what moves these trends is prices. People react to prices, especially in a world where wealth inequality is as vast as it is today, the increase in prices in energy, which is one of the most essential inputs into a human's day-to-day life, is going to cause a reaction. And I think even if the Inflation Reduction Act was successful in transitioning us to more wind and solar, you would still have that reaction because, like you mentioned, they are less dense forms of energy, and no matter how many of these turbines or solar farms that you build, the nature of these energy sources is going to lead to higher prices, which people will react to.
Yes, their resource demands are enormous, both for the construction of the equipment, but also for the operation of the system into which they are coerced. So American electricity will become much more expensive as that goes on. I quite agree with you about prices. I happen to think the IRA will actually start to have effects before the price impacts start to hit home, and these could be politically controversial if they are correctly understood and publicized. I mean, there is, of course, the well-known figures, the hundreds of billions of increases in taxes, which will be necessary to fund the tax credits that the IRA will make available to the green sector. But also, and I think in some ways perhaps more importantly, there are these vast capital transfers which are encouraged by the tax credits. Now, the US is no longer quite as rich as it once was, and there is a big opportunity cost there. So you're talking about several trillions of capital movements over a decade, and those figures can be calculated from analysis done by Princeton, very supportive of the IRA, by the way, but nevertheless you can extract these numbers from that work, and you can see the scale. So it's several $1 trillion over a decade, and that implies underfunding of things that the American people might prefer to see better funded: roads, schools, hospitals, and so on, and indeed defense. I mean, you might need to defend yourselves. So this opportunity cost could become extremely controversial if it is correctly discussed and the blame for that cost and that reallocation is identified, so that people understand that the reason why that the university program and the road program is underfunded is because you're pouring so much capital into the green sector.
Yes. And getting back to the concept of entropy and energy, because I think, like you mentioned, people are simply ignorant to this concept, or so it would seem if you're paying attention to the policy that's being implemented. Let's dive into the topic of entropy a little bit to educate the listeners about what it is and how it pertains to different types of energy sources and what types of entropy are advantageous for a human society that wants to progress and flourish.
Yes, it's a thorny concept, of course, in physics, and there are well-rubbed jokes about this, very highly polished jokes. You start off not understanding entropy, and then a light goes on and you do understand it, and then the light goes out again and you realize that you didn't really understand it, and finally you realize that you don't actually understand it, but you don't care anymore. And I think you have to keep things relatively simple. But it is a very deep concept, but it can be understood in fairly simple terms. It's fundamentally the difference between order and disorder, improbability and things that are probable and things that are highly improbable. And in terms of fuels, we're looking at fuels which are highly ordered, highly improbable, very unusual states of matter. And that's what the fossil fuels are, because they're derived from organic structures, so the result of organic evolution. They're very improbable molecular configurations, and they happen to be strong reservoirs, therefore, of energy. So we can break those bonds and release energy. And that orderliness of energy sources is the key to it. Once you've understood that, you can see, oh yes, the wind and the sun, they're actually relatively disordered sources of energy. This is close to random heat, and the intermittency about which we talk so much with regard to wind, and indeed it applies to solar too, although it's quite regular, is part of that disorder. It's not a source of energy that you can call upon at will to serve a particular requirement. You have to wait until the wind blows before you can generate electricity. Now, people will then say, but you need to store the electricity, and that will be the solution. But think again in terms of the entropy and the order and the disorder. So you've got a very disordered energy source. You need to correct that disorder. So you apply some order in the form of a battery. But where is that order coming from? Well, at the moment, of course, it's coming from fossil fuels because that's how we build our batteries. So we're injecting negative entropy, as it were, order to correct the disorder of the wind. And at that point, an engineer will say, well, why do we introduce the disorder in the first place? It would be much better to have a thoroughly orderly system. So we generate our electricity from uranium and coal and gas, and then we don't need to inject corrective measures because they're so ordered that they can develop their own support systems, the networks that supply consumers. So I think the simple statistical sense of entropy is the one that's most useful to explain to people. It's orderliness. And people understand the intermittency issue pretty intuitively. And I think that's a pathway in for people to see why wind and solar are so dangerous, actually, in energy systems. They just degrade the orderliness of existing systems. And that's all we've done in Europe. We've added huge wind fleets and solar fleets. And all we've done is to degrade the orderliness of our energy supply system. It's become more chaotic, literally more stochastic, actually, and thus much more expensive and fragile. And the exposure to natural gas in Europe, which is so controversial at the moment, has resulted in this extraordinary political blackmail from Russia. Well, natural gas is the sole thermodynamically capable fuel left in the system. That is supplying all the order which the system requires. It's that which actually fills in the gaps and supports the wind and solar fleets. So the order has to come from somewhere, and we're still relying on fossil fuels in spite of having all these wind fleets because of this fundamental difference between sources of high entropy and sources of low entropy like fossil fuels themselves.
The way you describe that, like order with denser forms of energy, feels like it's like a fractal, right? Because talking about the situation that Europe's in, particularly Germany, with their dependence on Russian natural gas, one can make the argument that a lot of what is going on in Ukraine may have been prevented if Putin didn't think he had the political chip in his favor, which is, hey, I have leverage because I have the energy. If Europe were to use more orderly forms of energy, like natural gas and nuclear, and really build out that capacity to support themselves, one could argue that we wouldn't have disorder at the geopolitical stage because Putin would not have that leverage over Europe that he has since they are dependent on his natural gas.
He wouldn't have had the courage, perhaps, to invade Ukraine if Europe had been not so obviously weak. The European system was already clearly deeply in trouble. I mean, people blame a lot of the current problems on the invasion of Ukraine. Well, that's not wrong in the sense that it's the immediate cause, it's the proximal cause of the difficulties. But actually things were very bad last year. You could see the European energy system staggering. There were huge fluctuations in prices. We've had a big blackout in the UK in 2019. There are lots of indicators of increasing fragility throughout the European system, particularly in the UK as it happens. And the Russians are very observant. They knew exactly what's going on. So this is a good moment for them to strike, as it were, because after all, they couldn't rely on us not waking up to the problem and fixing it. So it was a calculated risk. He thought this was perhaps a good moment to try it. As it happens, it seems not to have worked out very well for him. His own armed services have not performed well at all. And the Europeans have tried hard to support the Ukrainians, although perhaps not as vigorously as they would have been able to do had they been actually in much better shape. Yes, I quite agree. I think if Europe had been stronger energetically, it's quite conceivable that Mr. Putin would not have taken the gamble that he has.
Yeah. And I really want to dig into this point that energy abundance and availability to people globally is important for peace at the end. Because I agree with you. I do not like academic economists, but I am a very fond believer in free market economics to solve problems and to bring peace to the world, where if we can actually, a lot of the strife caused in the world is driven by the fact that we really don't live in free market economies. We have centrally planned monetary systems. We have centrally planned energy policy, centrally planned food policy, and all these things have led to these negative externalities that inherently cause friction in the physical world as the effects of these centrally planned policies begin to peak up in meat space. And so going back to the fact that the US and Europe has been, the energy consumption in these areas has been decreasing since 2007, correct? In
early 2000s, 2003, 4, 5, 6, depends on which country you look at, but around about, I say 2005 is a good average figure.
Mm-hmm. And in the West, I mean, the amount of energy being consumed has fallen materially, between 15 and 20% across the different areas. Right.
So in the UK, final energy consumption, total primary energy consumption, has fallen by about 30%. Which is huge. And we're now back to levels of consumption last seen in the 1950s, which is astonishing given the rise in population that we've seen over that period. And our final consumption of electricity has fallen by about 22% since that period. And we're back to levels last seen in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, I think that electricity figure, although it seems slightly less dramatic, is actually much more significant, because electricity is such a low entropy form of energy. It's a wonderful energy carrier. And it's the carrier which ought to be growing in a sophisticated and increasingly sophisticated and progressively more hospitable society for human beings. You should be using more and more electricity, not less and less. So it's a serious indicator of collapsing civilizational capability. We're just not as able to serve our needs as well as we were quite recently, actually. So, falling electricity consumption, I think, is the key indicator, but the total primary energy consumption figures tell their own story too, and are very dramatic.
Yeah. And I mean, and this is one of my favorite charts. I'm sure you're aware of it, but the Henry Adams curve, which goes back and tries to highlight energy consumption per capita. And there's just like an obvious plateau that starts in the 70s. And similarly, with electricity consumption in the West in the early 2000s, that's happening as well. All of the environmentalists and the elite cognoscenti in the political realm would say this is a success. We're losing less energy, but we have arguably more wealth, quote unquote, and people are speaking to each other via video stream across the oceans. Like, things are okay. Things are fine. This is good. We're becoming more efficient. But that's another thing you highlight in your article in Quillette, is that the more efficient we become with energy allows us to use more. You'll find that we'll use more because if you're more efficient in one space, that gives you more resources to allocate somewhere else where you have other needs.
Energy is like cash. It's never left on the table. This is a well-known point. This was brought forward by the chemist Justus von Liebig and the Englishman W.S. Jevons in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. It's not a theory. This is an empirical observation based on human history. But when you improve the efficiency of energy consumption processes, what you actually do is to lay the groundwork for increasing total energy consumption. And the reason for this, the fundamental reason for this, is that there is no limit to the improvements we will make in our environment to serve our own needs. We're never going to say, for example, that child mortality is low enough. We're always going to want to improve these things. Why shouldn't we? There's no reason why people shouldn't wish to keep on improving child mortality rates, improving the safety of their lives and the comfort of their lives. They never will say enough is enough. So energy consumption will always rise in a healthy economy. And therefore, when we look at falling energy consumption in the West, we know that it can't be energy efficiency. Energy efficiency may be buffering that falling consumption, but it won't be causing the fall in consumption. So as energy becomes much more expensive, yes, of course, people are desperately trying to improve efficiency processes. So that's, in effect, that's the system trying to return to trend, trying to return to growth. So they're protecting themselves against increasingly costly energy by improving the efficiency of their processes. But unfortunately, costs of energy keep on rising, and therefore people can't afford to actually use the energy. Now, there are things we would like to do, but we just can't do. And one of those things, and I think this is where falling consumption is critically dangerous for us. It's not simply serving contemporary needs, but it's repairing and maintaining the sophistication which we have accumulated over several millennia of civilization in the West. I think you can observe this in decaying infrastructure in the Western states. I think, actually, too, on my recent visit to the US, I can see it with you too. I think it's quite clearly evident that the infrastructure is slipping in the US, certainly is in Europe. And we should be much more concerned about this than we are. We're asleep, really.
Yeah. I would agree. The infrastructure decay here in the U.S. is very visible and palpable. I mean, it's weird because you have all these weird, again, centralizing forces. One being government contracts driven by the ability to print money. So I lived in Chicago for 6 years, and it's a pretty well-known fact that in Chicago, while we're on the concept of infrastructure and roads, is one of my favorite stories to tell, is the city, obviously the winters are pretty harsh in Chicago. There's a lot of snow, a lot of sleet, a lot of ice, and so the roads are continuously salted. And due to the fact that the city essentially has a jobs program where they want construction jobs year in and year out, they use a medium grade gravel to repave the roads every spring. And so to me, this always highlighted it's like a negative externality of these government contracts funded by easy money that just led to poor outcomes. And it seems like on the energy side of things, particularly with the subsidization of wind and solar, we're seeing something similar where it's not the roads that need to be repaved every year, but it's the service to solar panels, wind turbines, and underinvestment in more reliable, the higher grade gravel, if you will, to use an analogy, in oil and gas and nuclear.
Yeah, so the problems here in Europe are largely due to starvation of funds going into the conventional energy sector over the last decades, underinvestment due to overinvestment in renewables. That's quite clear. The refreshment cycle for renewables to which you allude is very real concern, actually. The lifetime of these pieces of equipment is quite short. They're sort of reverting to this point about the order and disorder of the fuels. I mean, I said that the disorderly nature of the wind and sun had to be corrected somehow. Well, one of the corrections takes place, of course, in the wind turbines and the solar panels themselves. They're very complex objects, actually, in some ways. And they're correcting it. But, of course, that means the wear and tear on them is quite considerable. I mean, effectively, they're being consumed in the correction process. So their economic lifetime is quite short. And the subsidy programs are usually grounded on the false expectation that costs will fall sufficiently to offset the extremely poor quality of the fuel, and also on the assumption that the equipment will last, say, for 25 or 30 years economically. It might last that long in physical terms, but it will be so poor by the end of that period that it won't be worth operating. So its economic lifetime is much shorter. So you're looking at increasing operations and maintenance costs for wind turbines and solar farm panel sites, which eventually exceed the income, and at which point it becomes economic to repower them. We think in Europe that the economic lifetime for wind is much, much less than the 25 to 30 years quoted by the industry. It's somewhere in the region of 10 to 15 years, actually, for wind. And for solar, perhaps a little bit better, but not quite clear. But then the performance of solar panels in Northern Europe is, as you can guess, absolutely pitiful. Why would you do it? The load factor in Germany is under 10%. In the UK, it's slightly above 10%. These are malinvestments, obvious malinvestments. No one should have built this stuff.
It's like as if they were to build solar farms in Chicago, where my freshman year in college, the sun didn't pierce the sun for 90 straight days.
Yeah. Well, you do it to show off. These are classic Veblen goods. You do something so obviously stupid to show just how rich you actually are. We're so rich we can afford to build solar panels in Chicago. That's.
Well, this is honing in on the malinvestment. Another part of the malinvestment with wind and solar, particularly, is land use, which is a topic that doesn't get enough attention in the overarching public debate about the green transition is the amount of land that these resources take up. They're extremely inefficient if you measure them simply on land use necessary to produce a megawatt hour.
Yes, and you might say that in the US that matters less than it does in the UK. Great Britain is a land area roughly the size of Minnesota, with 65 million people rather than 6 million people in it. So it's a very densely populated area. But it really matters to us. It's a very, very important consideration for us. This is effectively a land use conflict here in the UK. There's a lot of public resistance to renewable energy developments of all kinds. When onshore wind was very active in the 2000s, there were hundreds of resistance groups all over Britain fighting these things, and pretty effectively, actually. And at the moment, there's a big boom in solar. And solar is causing real concern, and not just amongst those directly affected by it, but those who are concerned about food production, so agronomists and so on. We're looking at situations where we have genuinely proposals for solar farms that cover 2,500 to 3,000 acres of British farmland, individual sites. And we think there are something like 100,000 acres currently under threat from solar farms. Well, British farmland is pretty good overall, and it's already an energy collector. It's collecting solar energy and turning it into a rather valuable form, food, which is humanly digestible. What kind of government would encourage the production of second-rate electrons when you can create first-rate food from your land? This is a very inefficient use of a national resource. So I don't think that will last. I think the brakes will go on at some point, but we will have lost quite a lot of farmland to this. So yes, the land conflict is very real in a small country like the UK. I don't think it's irrelevant in the US either. I've thought about this a bit, and well, some of my friends are quite relaxed about it. The US is a very big place. But then again, the truth is that the renewable development won't be randomly located in the US. It's going to tend to be closer to centers of demand, if it possibly can be, and particularly close to substations and close to grid lines. And that means that certain areas will become focuses of attention. And those could be areas that are very valuable for other purposes, whether that happens to be farming or residential requirements or other things, or perhaps just preservation on the grounds of environmental quality. So I don't think you'll be immune from land use conflict in relation to renewables, simply on the grounds that it won't be randomly distributed over the country. That where there are resources, they will tend to conflict with other uses that the American people would wish. Yes. And of course, the scale on which the White House is projecting renewable energy is absolutely gigantic. So it's unlikely to be invisible to Americans. It's going to become very visible if it indeed goes as far as that. I can see the brakes having to go on necessarily because you simply can't afford it quite quickly, actually.
One of my favorite land use conflicts here in the United States is the people up in Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, that area of the country, who often find themselves in the camp of championing the green energy transition, but they don't want it in their backyard when the wind turbines are set to go off the coast of their island towns. They throw a fit.
Who would blame them? One quite understands. It's a beautiful place. Why would you want to do that to it?
Yeah. And so is this would it even be possible to transition to the green energy economy set forth in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a very Orwellian thing to name, an act that is going to increase inflation?
Yes, I get asked this question on platforms. People say, you're saying, John, that we can't have a green economy. And my answer is always the same. I say, no, you can have the green economy, but you won't like it when you've got it. You won't like it at all. It's going to be deeply unpleasant. What effectively you're going to do is to enlarge the energy sector in relation to all other parts of the economy. There'll be much less energy left over to do the things you actually want to do. The energy sector will be the major consumer of its own output, as it was in the past. And we know what the structure will be like because we know what organic economies were like. That they were dominated by the energy production sector, which then was the land. So in the pre-coal era in Europe, particularly in Britain, it's a good example, the land owned most of the productive energy sector, almost all of it, and it employed nearly everybody. 75% of the British workforce, even in the 18th century, worked for landowners. Hence the enormous socio-political power of the gentry and aristocracy, hence their enduring romance, hence the romance of Downton Abbey. The socio-political power of the aristocracy pre-coal is absolutely gigantic because they own the energy sector and they employ nearly everybody. There's hardly any non-energy economy in the organic system. And that's what the future green economy will be like. We're all going to be working for the wind and solar industries, and there'll be hardly any other economic activities. In other words, we'll be poor. We'll be grinding poor because the energy sector will be consuming nearly all the available energy in order to try, probably fecklessly and hopelessly, to repair and reproduce itself. So yes, you can have a green economy, but you'll want to go back to fossil fuels pretty quickly.
Yes, you'll be working for all the wind and solar farms, which will be owned by the state because they'll be wholly subsidized by the money printer.
Which sounds like a condition for revolution to me.
Yes. And so this could bring this back to the public debate around this, because if we're going to give the governments of the West any credit, it is that they've successfully psychologically manipulated a lot of people to believe that this transition is not only worthwhile, but essential to human flourishing in the digital age as we continue transitioning into the 21st century. And I think a lot of the success that the government and the environmentalist groups have had is conflating the idea of increased energy consumption, particularly via fossil fuels and nuclear energy, with an increase in pollution. Are these two ideas, they can be mutually exclusive, can they not?
Yes, it's rather like, it's some kind of eating disorder, isn't it? I mean, it's like a sort of tragic conviction that food is actually poisoning you. Well, it may be that you're eating unhealthily and you're eating too, and perhaps you should change your diet, but you do need to eat. Yes, we've been convinced somehow that energy is something we can do without, but we really can't. But this goes back to the point about misconceptions of energy. And these are very widespread, even amongst highly educated people, even I'm sad to say, amongst engineers. You'll find people who don't really understand the concept of energy. Energy is not a thing. It's not a substance. It's a mathematical concept. It's extremely abstract. It's just a mathematical representation of the potential of causing change. And it's possessed by all inputs in an economy. So oil and gas are not energy, they're substances. They happen to have very advantageous energy characteristics. A lot of available energy in those substances. But energy itself is not a substance. So you can substitute for particular sources, oil, gas, whatever, but you can never substitute for energy. So we commonplace is to say that modern society is extremely energy dependent. All societies have always been energy dependent. Every organism is energy dependent. It's always maximal. It's always one. You're never less or more than one on energy because you cannot make any changes and maintain your own structure, your body structure as an organism, your society structure if you're a social organism, such as an economic organism. So energy dependency is always one. It's never less, never more. So we're not somehow aberrant and sinful in this respect. There's nothing new about the kind of our energy dependency. The early cities of Mesopotamia were the same. Hunter-gatherers are the same. They're just as dependent on energy as we are. We consume a lot of it because we have very sophisticated and comfortable societies. We don't have to worry about many things that were extremely dangerous to our ancestors.
No, but if we don't change the tide soon, we could be thrust back into...
We might. Yes, quite. Indeed. One does worry about that. As I say, you climb slowly in civilizational terms, but you get the energy supply wrong, you fall pretty fast.
Steps up, elevator down.
Quite like that. Yeah.
And I really want to drive this point home to the audience, how quickly, because there's two types of causal loops. One in the positive direction and one in a negative direction. And the one in the negative direction could be a doom loop. And How
Yes.
dire do you think the situation is? How close are we to getting sucked into a doom loop that we may not be able to get out of?
I really don't know, and I don't understand the relationship between the accumulated physical capital of our societies and our energy consumption well enough to be able to say at what point it becomes irrecoverable, where your accumulated capital is decaying so fast that you cannot arrest further decay, that you cannot increase the energy consumption to arrest the decay because your accumulated capital is falling so fast. But it could be quite abrupt. This was brought home to me actually when I was in Denver recently, and I was learning about small-scale oil and gas production in those areas around Denver, and particularly in the San Juan Basin. And I started reading articles about the geology of these areas. And once you start to go into an energy system like that in detail, you begin to appreciate how intellectually sophisticated it is. This is not crude business. And you have this impression it's just about drilling holes in the ground and getting stuff out. It's not like this at all. There's an enormous literature behind these industries. They know so much about the geological structure of these areas that they can find oil and gas. So it's intellectually very sophisticated. There are thousands of papers on in the geology of even quite small areas. Now, that kind of intellectual sophistication is quite easily lost. Once you've lost that, you just don't know where to look for the oil and gas in these areas. So once that sort of social reproduction of knowledge is interrupted, you're back to square one. You've got to recreate all that and learn again. And that sort of point, I think, is genuinely very concerning. If we get to the point where our intellectual capacities, our inherited knowledges are so damaged that we can't understand the literature around us in relation to energy sources, yes, we might go into free fall. I don't think we're close to it right now. I do think there is time. There is time to pull this around. I don't want to be. I'm concerned, but I'm not yet fatalistic about it. I think, and I wouldn't be talking to you about it, honestly, if I didn't think there was some chance of persuading people and turning this around before it's too late. But I do think we need to get our move on. I don't think it's a good idea to leave much longer.
No, I mean, particularly here in the United States, we really need to, where you have the current administration, and even behind that administration, a large environmentalist movement really beating the drum. Hey, we're going to phase out fossil fuels in the next 20 years. And going back to that point about losing that knowledge, how does that happen? Well, you completely disincentivize individuals from going to seek it out in the first place because they don't think there's going to be an economic benefit to harnessing that knowledge in the future.
Yes. And we know pretty much what this is like in relation to nuclear in the UK. We're one of the first countries in the world to develop nuclear energy, and we had at one point a very strong tradition in nuclear engineering. And I remember my last years in Cambridge as a minor variety of fellow in my own college. All the nuclear engineers were in their 70s and 80s. There were no young nuclear engineers, and that is pretty much the case today. We've gone from being a nuclear leader with a strong tradition in nuclear engineering, where it was being passed down from generation to generation, to being one where we're now unable to build our own nuclear power stations, and we're customers of the French state and the Chinese state, and that's clearly a disaster in societal terms for the UK, and it's clearly a retrograde step. It's a very serious loss of intellectual sophistication. And similarly, yes, you'll see the same thing in the US if you persist along this agenda, which, pray God you don't.
No. And then you have economic, physical constraints too. I have good friends who actually work in the oil and gas industry and are in control of running drilling schedules, and they're telling me that they can't get the steel for the casing to actually drill the wells. So as you have President Biden out there screaming at the oil and gas industry to go drill more wells, they're standing there like, hey, every rig crew in the country is literally working 24/7. If we want to, even if we wanted to drill more, we can't, because we don't have enough steel casing because of the supply chain mess ups that the economic lockdowns created. And There's so many again, going back to the fact that these are complex systems that central planners have completely corrupted, particularly in the last 5 years with the lockdowns and the mess up of the supply chains that don't allow you to fix things if you wanted to in a timely manner. I'm rambling right now, but I'm just getting worked up thinking about how we've messed up this energy policy. But I agree with you. We should be going toward denser forms of energy, nuclear specifically. And I guess that's a good sort of transition to talk about what are the misconceptions about nuclear energy? Why has it been so demonized? And what do you think we need to communicate to the market to get people more comfortable with this denser form of energy moving forward?
Well, since people are concerned about climate change, I think the rational approach is to say, all right, if you're that concerned about climate change, then you need a serious answer to it. And renewables are physically inadequate. They're simply not going to be able to produce the low carbon energy that you want to reduce emissions. So that if you persist down the renewables track, you will see an abrupt return to relatively inefficient fossil fuel consumption simply to maintain standard of living and to prevent the kind of societal collapse we've just been talking about. If you really want to see a long-term and truly sustainable, a dread word, but sustainable low-carbon economy, then it'll have to be nuclear. So this is, nuclear is the way to produce a long-term low-carbon economy. Some Greens already take this view. I mean, it's not just us. There are some out there, but most do not yet accept because they believe that renewables can actually do the job. So they hate nuclear more than they love the planet on the whole. Why do they hate nuclear? It's a mysterious subject. I mean, clearly the weapons program didn't help. It's mysterious, and it's a very superior kind of energy. So it's rather difficult to understand. It's not simple and obvious. And I suppose there's some residual dislike going back into the 1930s. Remember, the Germans rejected nuclear on the ground that it was Jewish physics. Thank goodness, because they would have achieved a bomb quite early if they'd pursued it. So we were fortunate in one respect. But I think that the hostility to nuclear goes very deep in Europe and maybe in the US as well, in this way that it's perceived as somehow it's earthy rather than ethereal. So the renewables have sky and sun kind of rhetoric to them. I mean, the wind turbine is a spin doctor's dream. It suggests a flower and a crucifix embodying rebirth and sacrifice image. It's an absolute gift. And it's completely useless as an energy producer, which is unfortunate. So yes, I think it's the earth-sky rhetoric is very persuasive to many people. They'd rather look up to the sky rather than accepting that actually to support our lives, we have to go down into the earth.
Well, that was another thing you touched on in your piece, which is, I think, very powerful, is that no other species or animal has ever used wind, particularly, as their energy source.
I find this an extremely compelling argument. I tried this on biologically trained friends, and I think a light goes on. I mean, it is literally the case that there are no organisms, none, that derive their fundamental metabolic energy from wind. I mean, the disorder, the entropy, is too high. It's useless. I mean, if it were possible for organisms to occupy that niche, as it were, they would. Human life, life is very, very investigative. It will find viable niches, and no organism has been able to use that niche. It's just too poor quality. The sun, yes, there are organisms that derive their fundamental metabolic energy from sun, but they are simple plants and by and large stationary, like the one just over your shoulder there. And they don't do much moving around. And they're stable and very simple creatures over long periods of time. Complex creatures eat those ones and, of course, collect and concentrate that energy. But there are many fewer of those, so you get the pyramid structure of life. Yes, I think it's extremely persuasive and explains why we're so foolish to think that we could even contemplate using wind.
Yeah, the only argument I could think of is maybe wind helps birds particularly conserve energy if they're using it as a tailwind.
Right. I'd say fundamental metabolic energy. So they can use it as an energy conserving trick. And of course, plants use it to disperse their genetic material through seeds and so on. But it's not actually providing the complex structure of their physical bodies. Is very, very interesting indeed. It's just a useless form.
I agree. It's very compelling, because then you can sort of ridicule humans, like, hey, why are we using this as an energy source when no other dumb animal is using it?
Because, as I say, it's a Veblen good. It's a way of showing off. It's demonstrating wealth. I mean, very rich people can afford to do daft things. They like to have wind-powered yachts, for example. And
well, now I'm thinking biblical, the hubris, when it gets to a heightened level, literally, will sometimes lead to a downfall. Are we too hubristic as a society right now?
It's curious to wonder whether the interest in renewables rose because we were unable to increase our consumption, that we began to run into difficulties with fossil fuels. That might be true in Europe. We don't have extensive resources there. Britain had some, and Norway has quite a lot. I think possibly not. I suspect that it's post-Cold War rhetoric that really accounts for this. Mm-hmm. I think we could have maintained exponential growth quite satisfactorily with fossil fuels and moved straightforwardly into nuclear, actually accumulated enough societal sophistication from fossil fuel consumption to make a smooth transition into nuclear, and that would have resulted in increasingly sophisticated and stable societies. But the Cold War rhetoric was important in discrediting nuclear, and one shouldn't underestimate propaganda efforts from Russia. The Russian propaganda on this was very effective. They destabilized the nuclear industries through the Green Movement in the 70s quite deliberately, and one can see exactly why they would want to do that. And I think that reverberates on today.
Yeah, and another lesser-known propaganda campaign was here in the United States. The natural gas industry had negative campaigns against nuclear because they didn't want it to take their market share.
Yes, I think this conflict between high-grade fuels is very unfortunate and short-sighted, and I never miss an opportunity on a platform to try to bring them round to each other. Nuclear has no future without fossil fuels. In order to be able to adopt nuclear energy, you need to be very sophisticated. This is a difficult fuel to use. It's very high quality, but it's difficult. So you need to be very sophisticated and clever to do it. To get sophisticated and clever and stay sophisticated and clever, you need fossil fuels. And similarly, the fossil fuel industry should recognize that they are necessary to the nuclear future. And the nuclear future is quite a way off, actually. It's going to take a while to move towards very sophisticated and high-grade nuclear usages. And this is a point worth making. You asked about the nuclear industry in general earlier, and I'm more of an historian than I am an engineer, but one of the lessons of history is that technological development is quite slow, actually, and nuclear is still a very new thing. I know the industry likes to say that it's mature, but, historically speaking, that's not really true. This is actually very early days for them yet. Their best days are to come, I trust. You think about the steam engine. The first steam engines were built in Europe in the late 1690s, in the late 17th century. They weren't really good until the late 19th century, by which time there'd been enough societal sophistication, particularly in metallurgy, to allow them to develop very high pressures in the boilers so that they could produce very high thermal efficiencies. And that's just before the steam engine became obsolescent, of course, around the world. So that's a couple of hundred years. It takes time. So I'd be very patient about nuclear, and I think the nuclear industry should be more modest about this and recognize that they have a symbiotic relationship with fossil fuels, and there to be less self-harming, mutually self-harming rhetoric from these two industries, and recognize that they work together for human benefit.
Oh, there you go. You froze for a minute. I agree. They should be working together, especially considering the environment right now. They're both going to get kicked out of the energy mix by
Yes.
this movement of zealots pushing us towards wind and solar specifically.
Right, and they believe that correctly that their fuels will be used by human beings again. That they think they have a bright future. That eventually sanity will dawn. That people will come back to fossil fuels and to nuclear. I agree. That's perfectly true. I think they underestimate the danger that it may not be their companies that actually extract and deliver those fuels. And indeed, within the US, that it may not be Americans that actually consume these fuels. So you may stop using your oil and gas and your coal, but other countries, for example, those in Asia, may be quite happy to use you as a resource extraction base. And you may not like that very much. So they'll prosper. You'll become an economic backwater that sells first-rate fuels to earn your living. Not an attractive prospect for you, I think.
No, not at all. Especially as I've got young children as well. Thinking about the world that they're growing up in, that prospect seems untenable to me as a father, and that's why I'm happy to be speaking with you today to get this message out there, because I do think it's extremely important. And maybe the last thing we can touch on, again, we mentioned earlier, a lot of people in the West will say, hey, you two are live streaming, video streaming over the internet. Things are fine. Yes, we're using less energy, less electricity, but look, you're doing things that 10 years ago would have been impossible. And you would highlight that this is happening in spite of the reduction of energy and electricity usage in the West. It is being wholly subsidized by increased usage in parts of the world like Asia and India.
Exactly. And Deborah Lieberman and I say that explicitly in the Quillette piece. We're living on Asian energy consumption at the moment. I mean, in effect, we're borrowing money to buy Asian goods. It's an anesthetic. We have a portal line of anesthetic wealth flowing in from Asia, which is hiding our own economic decline for us. But that's not a recipe for long-term prosperity. We've lost a lot of productive capacity in the West. Asia has built it up. Now, you only have to go and look at the energy consumption figures by sector to see how dramatic this is. You look at industrial energy consumption in the United States, for example, and compare it with that of China. Only a few years ago, the US was consuming more energy in the industry, not much more, but more. Now China is consuming very much more energy in its industry than the United States, and American industrial energy consumption is falling. Most importantly, its industrial electricity consumption is falling even faster than overall. So you're de-electrifying, which again is a very serious concern. It suggests that you're moving towards simpler processes. So you're living on Asian production, and that makes you vulnerable. Vulnerable in several respects. Firstly, that at some point Asia may choose not to transfer wealth to you in this way. They may not wish to. They may have nothing that they require from you, and let's interrupt that flow. Or that in return for that, they may want greater control over your political administration. If this line of anesthetic is to be maintained, they may demand greater intervention in your conduct and behavior. It would not be irrational at all for them to do that. But I think the short-term concern is that the productive capacities in Asia are so great that they can be transferred to other purposes should they wish to. So should there happen to be, and let's hope there never is, a shooting war between the US and China, China has an enormous productive capacity which can quickly be repurposed towards materiel rather than iPhones for your personal consumption.
Yes.
They can put their foot to the floor. I'm not sure you could in the US anymore.
No. It's a shame. Again, going back to hubris, I think this empire has gotten fat, happy, complacent, and dumb. It just seems objectively stupid and ignorant what administration. I mean, it's been happening for decades now, or at least 2 decades. This movement towards these less reliable energy sources here in the U.S. and I do worry that it would take a pulling of resources from China or something like that from the U.S. to force the issue at home, where people wake up and say, "Oh, this is really important."
Yes, but it really isn't too late. Churchill famously said that the U.S. is a remarkable place. It always does the right thing eventually, having tried every other possible option. I think you can do this, but it will require quite a lot of public campaigning. And I think it's not simply the people. I mean, I think actually probably the American people understand this pretty well already. The problem is in your intelligentsia. It's through your university classes and the upper parts of your federal administration and even perhaps the individual state administrations. Your bureaucracy, your civil service, and also, I think, sadly, your military. I mean, we have the same problem in the UK. There's serious talk about low-carbon war as if this were actually objective. The point is to win and defend your country. Now, there may well be low-carbon ways of producing highly effective defense services, but we don't know of them yet. There are nuclear-powered submarines and ships, but not nuclear-powered planes or indeed battlefield equipment such as tanks. This is a way off, actually. So the re-education is not simply with the American people at the blue-collar level. I think those people are pretty sensible. They understand these things intuitively rather well, actually. And I think the engineer on the street, as it were, also understands it. Their voice is not heard. But the bureaucracy and the political classes, and as I say, I think actually the military, these are targets for our campaigning. We should try to explain these. They're not stupid people, but they are definitely wrong about this.
I don't think they're stupid either. Are they nefarious, though? I don't know.
I think we have to assume that the intentions are good for the purposes of discussion. I'm sure thinkers in there, I dare say. Cui bono, who benefits, is always a good question when you see something particularly foolish in politics. And doubtless there are people who understand these things very well and are expecting to make a lot of money out of the adoption of renewable energy. And when that collapses, they will reinvest their winnings from the renewable energy phase in the corrective measures needed to restore wealth in the fossil fuel and the nuclear industry. So there'll be a huge wealth transfer, which will be permanent.
It's also tiresome. Why can't we just be sensible and recognize common sense logic, which is we should be using denser and denser forms, not reverting to 15th century windmills and solar farms. Not that they were around in the 15th century, but
the decision was taken. We're now in a very difficult position. Correct. So if it had been stopped in the early 2000s, it would have been fine. But we're now so committed. But the US is not in such a dire position as Europe. I mean, you really haven't yet started. I know that you've got stalling energy consumption, but your energy consumption is not yet falling sharply as it is in Europe. So, your situation's bad, but not yet critical as ours is.
No, we should be looking to Europe and saying, hey, let's not
absolutely
repeat this. I mean, you just had BASF leave Germany after being there for over a century, correct?
Yes, and European car manufacturers are now looking to manufacture electric vehicles to take advantage of electric vehicle mandates in Europe, but they're going to manufacture those EVs in China. Needless to say. As I say, I don't think this will run on forever, but it could run on for a very long time. There's quite a lot of wealth to erode in Europe still, and to transfer, of course. But the situation in the US is, although it's bad, you can turn this around. And I think if it's turned around in the US, then there's a chance for turning it around in Europe as well. You've been, the arsenal of democracy before, and you may have to be so again.
No, one thing that I'm very optimistic about here in the United States particularly is this trend of states asserting their autonomy from the federal government and beginning to ignore federal government guidelines in different areas of the world. Marijuana was probably the first big mover a decade ago. And obviously with the COVID lockdowns, different states took different approaches to what they were going to mandate or not mandate their citizens to do. And I think we will begin to see that trend insert itself into the energy policy world as well. And then for the context of this podcast, for a Bitcoin podcast, I do a lot of Bitcoin mining, and I'm beginning to see that trend pop up as well, where more states like Texas, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Wyoming are really not falling prey to the rhetoric of the Elizabeth Warrens of the world, who are trying to demonize the Bitcoin mining industry for its electricity usage and say, hey, it's okay. They're going to help us actually expand electricity capacity on grid and off grid, which I think could actually be a benefit to overall energy supply here in the United States in the long run.
Yes, the federal system is certainly a great advantage, and independent decision-making on energy in the federal states federated states would be immensely beneficial. I'm worried that the centralization of energy policy through the Inflation Reduction Act will gradually erode the independence of the states in relation to energy. We've seen this in Europe, after all. We have national governments, but our renewable energy policies, when the UK is out of the EU now, so I suppose I can say their energy policies, we're still under them, however. But those energy policies were so dirigiste that the independent national governments actually couldn't exert their independence. So they were simply delegated responsibility for meeting targets in energy. And I would be concerned that the federal government in the US will follow that European model and attempt to disarm the individual states on energy policy. So it's something that has to be watched very carefully indeed.
Well, this is why I'm very bullish on Bitcoin mining permanent funds, because the way the federal government would do that is say, hey, if you don't meet these targets, you don't get federal funding. And at the state level, at the municipal level, at the county level, wherever you may be, Bitcoin, being that it's a mechanism to monetize electricity on site in any location on the world, provides you with the opportunity to say, hey, we're going to go issue a municipal bond, raise a bunch of cash, buy a bunch of Bitcoin miners and plug it in, maybe off-grid at a stranded natural gas well, or maybe on-grid. You have a utility company that has a substation worth 20 megawatts. They're only serving 10 megawatts of that electricity to market, so they'll use the excess 10 megawatts to mine Bitcoin, and then they can roll those Bitcoin revenues up into a permanent fund that allows them to bolster themselves against the federal government. When the federal government comes and says, hey, we're not going to give you the money, the local government can say, hey, we actually don't need it. We've been mining Bitcoin and monetizing our energy on site, and you have no power here. This is the future I dream of as a Bitcoin miner.
Well, good luck. Yeah, further independence for the states is a very good idea. I'm centralized. The Brexit vote, which is in jeopardy at the moment, after all, with the removal of the Truss government, but nevertheless, the will to self-determination is very strong, and people have given various explanations for the Brexit vote, but essentially it was that we didn't wish to be governed from Brussels or Berlin. Mm-hmm. People make laws for themselves, and the United States is the United States. And the people living in the individual states wish to make laws for themselves, and that's an excellent ambition and to be lauded. So, as I say, good luck.
Well, thank you. Well, again, but this whole problem goes back to what we were discussing in the beginning of the discussion, which is proximity to the source of information. Like, that's what really irks me about the federal government here in the United States. You have a bunch of parasites in D.C. trying to make decisions for people in the middle of Wyoming, and they're literally thousands of miles away from the information that is pertinent to the decisions that need to be made on the ground in Wyoming. And similarly, with Brexit and Brussels, the literal distance between the source of information and the people making decisions to solve problems that they believe exist there just doesn't compute from an information system perspective.
No, that's even assuming that they are benevolent, but of course their interests are likely to be different from those people. So even if they have the information, they're likely to use it to serve their own interests rather than the people of Wyoming. But as it happens, they don't have the information, so they make bad decisions, both from their own perspectives and those of the people. It's a disaster for everybody. Yes, of course. I mean, distributed information processing is clearly the answer to this. If we were to undistort the energy markets and simply allow people to choose energy sources that serve their needs, you would see a straightforward graph. The price signals would encourage it. And you could say, well, that doesn't address climate change, to which the answer is, okay, if you're very serious about that, then the individual states should be allowed to apply carbon taxation, but only a single instrument. I'm not wholly against decarbonization, but it has to be economically compelling. If it isn't so, it's simply not going to work. I mean, climate policy, and I think for the avoidance of doubt, I state my position on climate policy in practically every talk I do. I mean, climate policy is like an insurance policy, and it has to pass the basic tests of any insurance policy. It has to provide real cover. It has to provide, it has to be affordable in itself. And the premium you're paying has to be proportional to the risk, hazard times probability, insofar as you understand it. And those sorts of decisions have to be left up to people on the ground. They have to make decisions about it. They have to decide, is the cover we're being offered real? For us, can we actually afford it? And at the moment, these decisions are being taken by central government, and with the result that actually there is no real cover. The policies don't protect people against what climate change there is, or indeed the natural disasters which are not caused by climate change, but are just normal fluctuations in weather. And the costs are unaffordable in themselves and utterly disproportionate to the risk, hazard times probability, insofar as we understand it, which is not terribly well. In fact, ordinary people on the ground understand these things much, much better than central decision makers, and they'd be much wiser and more prudent. They would discount the future much more appropriately, but they would also take sensible decisions about the future, because after all, they're looking after their families. They're not indifferent to the future at all. They're not short-run hedonic robots. They love their children, and I have children too. They're quite tiresome actually, but I love them very much. But you do think about the future, but you think rationally about it, which bureaucrats never do. They enter into this extraordinary position where they want you to not discount the future at all, because after all, being bureaucrats, they believe in perfect knowledge.
Yes, perfect knowledge does not exist.
No,
it's again, maybe the theme of this episode is the hubris of man and his inability to step back from the wheel and say, hey, maybe I can't control this. Maybe we should let emergent complex systems take care of themselves.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far down the hubris thing, because I might get into the situation saying, well, we deserve the crash that's coming. And I do actually want to avoid the crash if we possibly can.
I do as well.
Yeah, both for my own sakes. I think it could come within my own lifetime, and certainly for my children. Yes,
well, hopefully conversations like this begin to wake people up, because, again, Dr. Constable, I want to thank you for coming on. It's been
great pleasure, Marty.
It's been the pleasure has been all mine. Again, I think the message that you're spreading is extremely important. Not only that, it's extremely clear and very easy to grok once you take the time to sit down, read your writings, and understand the perspective that you're coming from and that you're trying to imbue on your audience. And so I hope that anybody listening to this today, share it with one of your friends that is saying that we need to transition to wind and solar, that fossil fuels are bad, that nuclear energy is dangerous.
Think again.
Yeah, the prospect of a world without them is much, much scarier than one with them.
Absolutely. Yes.
Well, thank you again for your time. This has been an immense pleasure. We're going to get this out right away. Where can anybody who is curious to find out more about what you're working on, what you have written, what you plan to do in the future, where can they find you?
I write for several organizations in London. I write for the Global Warming Policy Foundation, and some of my studies there, including a large study on the European Union's energy policies, freely downloadable from that site. I also run a small charity publishing data on the renewables sector here in the UK. It's called Renewable Energy Foundation. As I say, it's not an industry lobby. We just happen to know a lot about renewables, probably more than the industry does in some respects. And that's all free information. You can find a great deal there. But of course, I published individual articles here and there, for example, in Quillette and other places too. But anybody wishes to get in touch, they can doubtless find you, and you can pass their on to me. I'm happy to correspond with any interested party about these things. I'm coming to the US increasingly often now to talk, and I'm very open to invitations to come and speak. I regard this as immensely important, and I'm very happy to travel to do so. This is a matter of great importance for all of us.
Agreed. And if you ever make your way to Texas, let me know. We'd love to have you sit in the chair across. Maybe we can do this in person next time.
I look forward to that. It'll be great fun.
Awesome. Well, it is the evening where you are. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's all we got today, freaks. Peace and love. Take care.